Have you ever thought about all the things on which you rely? Let's just think about this for a second. All those things by which you rely on them and you depend upon them. That if they fail, it's like, oh my goodness. This right here, my cell phone. Have you ever gone out of the house and you left your house and you left your cell phone? You know, I used to leave without my wallet and feel naked. Now I leave without my cell phone and I'm like, oh my goodness, I might as well just be out there without any clothes on. Because it's the way I feel. I feel so vulnerable without my cell phone because I've learned to depend upon my cell phone. Maybe it's another piece of technology you've learned to depend on. Maybe it's Facebook. That you've learned to rely on Facebook or social media, that you can't go hours. It's hard for you to even go a day without logging on or seeing what's going on. Maybe it's other technology. Maybe it's your laptop computer. Maybe you rely on that. You rely on that laptop. It's your source. It's your brain. It's everything. It's how you use it. Maybe it's your tools because you work on a construction site. Maybe it's your tools that you rely on. And the thing with that is we are very reliable. We rely on things. We're very dependent people. We also depend on this earth. I mean, we need food. We're dependent. We need food that this earth brings. And we need the commodities that we take and the resources that this earth provides to put a floor that we can stand on, a seat that's comfortable that we can sit on, a bed to sleep on, covers to put ourselves under, and a roof over our heads to protect us. We depend upon this earth. We are very dependent people. Humanity is very dependent. And the thing is, unfortunately, that technology and most of the things that we depend upon, they're going to fail us. Your phone, you're going to need to upgrade. Your car that gets you to work, you're going to have to trade that in or get it fixed or repair it. It's going to fail you. And that laptop computer, get to 3 or 4 years old, and that thing's the dinosaur now. And it's going to drag its feet, if proverbial feet, because it doesn't have feet, just so you know. It's going to get really slow. You're going to have to replace it with a more dependable option. See, technology, and really this earth fails us in some ways. And you know what else fails us? Is people sometimes fail us. Even though we depend upon people, all the connections we make, we depend upon people from the infancy. We depend upon parents. We depend upon companies. We're so dependent on people. And unfortunately, just as technology fails us, just as this earth we rely on fails us, people fail us. And because people fail us, it's hard to rely on each other. It's hard to rely on people. And I was thinking about this, and I came up with 4, I think, are basic reasons, and maybe you could figure out others that you could say that this is why it's hard for us to rely on people. And so write these in your notes. The first one that I believe it's hard to rely on people is people aren't perfect. They don't always do what they say they will do or what they should do. Maybe you've discovered that in life, and that's why it's hard for you to rely on people, because you realize people aren't perfect. They don't do what they say they're going to do or what they should do. You have these expectations. Maybe it was a relationship that you had, and because of that relationship, that you elevated them on a pedestal, and when they didn't reach, their behaviors didn't match that elevated pedestal and their expectations that you had, they fell short and they failed you. Unfortunately, this happens more often than we think. It happens a lot in marriage, that we get married and all these things we expect and our spouse should do, they don't do. See, when that people fail us, and when they say I do at the beginning, at the altar, it's only I do until someone else shows up. Or it's I do until bankruptcy happens, or it's only I do, and it's short term until some other variable comes into play, and they fail us. And then it's hard to rely on people. Our trust is broken, and it's hard to rebuild that trust. Another reason is people aren't always patient. Right? That in people aren't always patient, especially when we're not perfect. Especially when we aren't perfect. See, maybe it was a parent growing up that was always quick to point out when you failed. And it was always that parent that no matter all the good things you did or how many times you tried, as soon as you messed up, they pointed out, and you felt like you were always being judged. And they were always down on you, and you never could do it right. And they just weren't patient with you so you could get it. Another reason I believe people fail us is people are selfish. They use us for their own purposes. Maybe it was somebody you were dating. Maybe that guy, ma'am, and you thought he was unlike any of the other guys until that night when you just realized he just wanted you for his own purpose, his own selfish purposes. Maybe it was a friend that you were building a great friendship with, and then you thought that, man, this is a friend that I can rely on. And then when you needed to rely on them, you found out that they were only in the friendship for what they could get out of you. And all of a sudden, people become unreliable, and then you back away. And then the last one is this, is people don't always show up when I need them. Maybe it was your kids when you got older and you needed your kids around and they didn't show up. Maybe it was you needed a parent at a certain season in your life, but that parent didn't show up for you. Maybe it was the church that didn't show up for you. Much worse, a pastor or a church leader that didn't show up for you. And because of this, you found out that people are unreliable. And when you saw people as unreliable, you began to view God as unreliable. And this series, I believe, helps us with this. Because this is the thing, is when we paint God the way we picture people, we incorrectly perceive God. When you paint God in the way that you view people around you, and their unreliability, you project on God. You say, God, I can't rely on you. And in this series, I want us to look at God, and I want us to repicture, reimagine, re-see, if that is even a word, who God is. Because maybe your view of God has been incorrectly projected. Maybe how you paint God through the picture of the people or church leadership in the past that has failed you. Or maybe through an abusive parent. Or maybe through someone who you relied on in the past and they've failed you. And in this, you say, God, I can't rely on them, so I don't know if I can rely on you. I don't know if I can trust you to do what you say you'll do. I don't know if I can trust that you're going to be a patient father. You almost see God as an impatient judge just waiting for you to mess up. Or maybe you see God as this selfish guy upstairs that doesn't care what goes on in your life and only leverages your life for his unfortunate pleasure. Or maybe you feel like you can't rely on God because God has never showed up for you. In this series, regardless of your reason, if you've left the faith or you have incorrectly perceived God, I want you to see God in a new light. And John, who was an apostle of Jesus, who was young and a teenager when he started following Jesus, he saw Jesus, he walked with Jesus, he spent the night with Jesus, he lived with Jesus in many aspects. He saw Jesus' first miracle. He saw Jesus turn water into wine. He saw Jesus take bread and multiply it to where it fed thousands of people. He saw Jesus raise people from the dead. He saw people who were blind be able to see and those who were lame be able to walk. He saw Jesus be persecuted. He saw Jesus handle the cursing and the persecution and the hatred of mankind toward him. He saw Jesus take all of that to a cross. As these people led him up a hill and nailed him on a cross, he saw Jesus breathe his last breath. He was there in this gap, and he felt the pain of loss. John saw then a resurrected Jesus, where breath re-enters Jesus, and John saw Jesus go up into heaven. And John knew something about God. Because John knew Jesus. Because John knew Jesus, John knew God. And he said he wanted to impart something to his listeners, the people who would read his letters, the people who would he wanted to let you know what he knew. And in this first letter that we have called the 1 John, because we're very creative people when we capture these things. In 1 John chapter 4, look what he writes. He goes, and so we know. He goes, I want you to know like I know something. He goes, so we know and rely. This is something that you just don't know, because there's a lot of things you know that you don't actually put your weight of trust and you depend upon it. But he goes, I want you to have knowledge of this and so much that you can depend upon this, that you will know that you can rely on this, that you can rely on the love God has, not just for him, but he says us. And he includes you and I as the readers. That you and I, we can know and rely on the love God has for us. And he makes a statement right here that reveals who God is in a new way. He says, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. John was confident. John was confident that he and his readers could rely on God and most importantly on the love that God has for them. And maybe this is where you are. Maybe you've been following Jesus for 30 years. This is for you. And maybe you've been seeking who God is for 30 minutes. And that's why you're here today. I want you to lean in, because in this series, I want us to learn that a little more, that we can rely on who God is, because God is a God who loves. And that's our series big idea that we're going to lean into the next couple of weeks, and this is, write it in. God who loves invites me to rely on his love. That God is a God who loves. And because he's a God who loves, he invites you and I. He extends an invitation every day. He extends an invitation to you to rely on his love by accepting his love. My hope is that in this series, that you will have a revelation, a bigger revelation of who God is and his love that he has for you. And I want you to do two things. One, first, I want you to be able to accept his love. This is not something you just do one time. This is a continual thing. I want you to grow in accepting his love. Like it's a gift that you can't earn. Like it's a gift that you don't deserve. I want you to grow in accepting this love as a gift. And secondly, I want you to learn to rely on God's love. If you feel God has failed you in the past, maybe you feel God has failed you because people have failed you, I hope this series helps you refocus on who God really is and not the picture that we've painted or you've painted based on how you perceive the church or Christians. And I hope that you can begin to rely on God's love that he has for you, to depend upon it, to depend on him. Again, to put your full confidence in who Jesus is and who God is. I believe that one of our biggest hurdles in understanding, accepting God's love, and relying on God's love is really us. And I believe one of the hurdles that I have, that's the biggest one for me, and maybe it's yours today, is this perfectionism. It's perfectionism. It's this, because we put an ideal in front of us that unless I can be perfect, then I'm not even going to try. And this is something that I believe our culture today is bombarded with. That there are so many options available to us that we fear failure. Not only do our kids go to school and they have more options of a major than we had, or maybe you had growing up, but all of these options, they now can create their own major in some schools. They can pick, and it's like choose your own adventure and we'll make a major for you. And now they have all these options with these high expectations. And now they come, and this social media doesn't help, because social media, all it does is puts on the best front. That you see everybody's perfect day. And when you see everybody's perfect day, you kind of become ashamed of your imperfect day. And all these options, you fear, you get paralyzed, and you go, why would I even try? I can't even make a choice because I'm paralyzed by all these options. And then you see everybody else's perfection that they post. And you feel the shame of your life in such a way. And in such ways, we begin to, I believe, not even want to commit to things. That's why I believe this generation coming up has a hard time committing. Because there's this fear of failure. There's this fear of not being perfect. And if I can't even be perfect, then I'm not even going to try. And maybe that's why you have resisted church. Maybe that's why you've resisted God. God, if I can't even live perfectly for you, then I'm not even going to try. That's why today, this is the teaching big idea. Write this in. Even though I fail, God who loves never fails me. Today, I want us to explore this, that even though we fail, it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. And even when we fail, I want us to know that there is a God who loves, who though you fail and I fail, he will never fail us. There was a psalm that the Old Testament writers incorporated in their scriptures, and they would repeat this, and it was something that was repeated throughout the entire history of Israel. And it was this truth that God's love would never fail. And this is the way they would say it. This is one psalm that captures it. It says, praise the Lord. Give thanks to the Lord. Give thanks to our God, it says. For he is good. And the reason he is good is this. His love endures forever. In this statement, his love endures forever, is the statement that says God is love. And because he is loved, he's always loved, and he will love, and he always will love. And it's endured for the age of time because God himself is love. And because God is love, he displays his love through his goodness. And this goodness has been on display since the beginning of time. When we read Genesis and God created the earth, God creates. And in his creation, he ends his statement of creation and says, it is good. And when he gets to humanity, he makes man and woman. And he looks back and he said, it is good. And I want us to see why it was good. Here's the reason it was good. Look with me in Genesis chapter 2. Adam and his wife are both naked. That's good. That was really supposed to be funny. Isn't that good? I mean, really, that's good. I mean, Adam looked at that. That's good, Jesus. God, that's good. See, that was good, but this is the reason that was good. This is the real reason. They felt no shame. They felt no shame. See, they could look at each other and not feel the shame of being naked. And then something not so good happened. After God stated that he made man and the woman and they made them in their purity and there was no shame, they were perfect. Then something not perfect happened and something not good happened, and man sinned by disobeying God's command. And look what happens in this. In verse 7 of chapter 3, it says, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. What do? They realized their shame. They realize their imperfection. So what do? They do what we all do. We try to cover up our shame. They sewed fig leaves together. And look what it says. They made coverings for themselves. They try to protect their imperfection. They try to protect their shames because they saw their imperfections now. And they try to make perfect what they had made perfect. And look what happens. Then the man and his wife heard something. It was the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And what do? They hid from the Lord God among the trees. Why? Because they were aware of their imperfections. That causes us to hide. Isn't that what we do when we make a mistake? And that's what we say nowadays. It's a mistake. We saw incorrectly. We spoke incorrectly, and that's why we say it's hard for us to say we were wrong. I mean, when's the last time you said that? When's the last time you admitted you were wrong? When's the last time you admitted you sinned? You know, why is it the hardest thing to do this in a marriage? Why is it so hard? Men, we struggle with this. Why? Because we try to cover our shame. We try to take ownership of it. And we try to achieve perfection by hiding our imperfections. Ladies, we do this. We do this with our kids. It's hard to admit we're wrong. And look what happens here. But the Lord God called the man, "Where are you?" I wish I was James Earl Jones, because that's the way I expect God to sound like when he talks. That was my best poor example. He answered, man answers, "I heard you in the garden, and I was," say that with me, "afraid." Why? Because I was naked, aka because my shame was exposed. Because of my imperfections, I was afraid to expose my imperfections to God. Therefore, I hid. I was afraid because I wasn't perfect. And he said, God speaking, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from that tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" And then the man does what all humanity does, because we were born into Adam. This is our nature. Look what he says. "The woman you put here." God, did you see her? She was naked. And that was good. And if whatever she said for me to do, you know I was going to do it. Why'd you put her here? And this is what happens. See, anytime we feel the shame, you know what we do? We cast blame. Anytime we feel the shame, we pass the blame. This is what the woman did. When the blame was put on her and now her shame is exposed, no, see, it wasn't me. It was the serpent you gave me. The serpent you put there. I passed the blame on. See, I believe this, right? They said perfectionism is often rooted in our shame. That the reason you and I try to achieve, we try to hide it, our imperfection, and try to make ourselves appear perfect, is because of the shame that we have. And it's natural to have shame because you and I were born in sin. We were born wrong. And whenever we try to hide it, one way we hide it is we pass the blame. And we shift the blame. We all do this. See, perfectionism is a self-righteous deception. And it's a way we deceive ourselves that we deceive ourselves that we are able to be perfect in our own good. And the reality is, you can't. You can't be perfect. You can try to be the perfect boss. You can try to be perfect, but the more you try to achieve perfection, the more you're going to be aware of how shamefully you fail at being perfect. It's why we try to protect ourselves by appearing perfect. Husbands, that's why it's hard for you to admit to your wife, you're wrong. Wives, it's why it's hard for you to admit to your spouse, you're wrong. It's why it's hard to admit to our parents, we were wrong. It's because we try to hide. We try to hide, and we try to hide from God, and we try to cast off, and it was somebody else that made me do it. It was this, and it's also the reason we try to blame in a game where our team doesn't win, like last night. And the first thing you want to do is you want to push the blame on something. But the reality is, me. I was wrong. And look what the Lord does here. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed him. Here, God makes the first sacrifice to cover man's shame. Here, God makes an act of love. And in his love, he displays his mercy. And he makes the first sacrifice because it's through sacrifice that shame is covered. Look at this. Because God is love, God shows mercy. God's mercy has been on display since the beginning of time. Every day that you get dressed should serve as a reminder of God's love that has been on display since the beginning of time and his mercy that is available to you. Why? Because God dressed man at the beginning by making a sacrifice to cover his shame. And every day that you and I wake up and we put on our shirt, we put on our pants, and we cover what we don't want to expose to everybody. It's a reminder that God, even when I fail, your love never fails me. It's new. Your mercy is new every morning. This is what God's mercy does. God's mercy, write this in, protects me from the punishment, from being imperfect. That's what mercy does. It protects you and I, just like our clothing protects our body. God's mercy protects you and I from punishment. Now, it doesn't protect us necessarily from the consequences. Adam and Eve still had consequences. Consequences are different than punishment. Consequence of Eve was that childbearing would be painful. And all those women out there said, oh. For the man, it was that the consequence of man's sin is that now we have to work and we labor for our survival. But the punishment of sin, the punishment was the predetermined penalty for sin, which was death. And God absorbs the penalty of death by making a sacrifice at the beginning. And he allows this sacrificial system to absorb the punishment. So, because something has to die when sin is involved. That's the punishment of sin, is death. And through sacrifice, God in his love gives us mercy. And because God is love and his mercy, God offers, write this in, forgiveness. That because a punishment was laid now on a sacrifice, he now can freely offer forgiveness to you and I. That because of his mercy, we receive forgiveness. And we can rely on his love. We can rely on his mercy, and we can rely on his forgiveness. Look what the Hebrew writer says about forgiveness. It says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. He gives us a light into why the sacrificial system was such a part of the Israelites' history. It's because it's through sacrifice that God punished sin. And in his mercy, he allowed that sacrifice to take a punishment that you and I, because we are sinful people, deserved. Sacrifices then would occur time and time again, year after year. And anytime someone did wrong, they would go and make a means in a sacrifice and put the punishment on that animal. And God, in his mercy, knew that this was a system that couldn't sustain. And look what he does. In verse 1 of chapter 10, the Hebrew writer says this: the law, which is that Hebrew law, but it's not really any type of law that we try to perfect ourselves and say, hey, this is the standard by which we have to live. The law, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly, year after year after year, make perfect those who draw near and worship. Did you know coming to Sunday won't make you perfect? Coming to church? Did you know that you can't do enough good to make you perfect? There's nothing you can do. There's no prescribed effort that you can have to make you perfect. Otherwise, if you could, then once you achieved it, then you could stop, he says, you could stop that. He says, otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered, talking about these sacrifices? For, then he goes on in verse 14, for by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy. What does Jesus do? In his one sacrifice, when he comes and he lives the perfect life that we can't live, and he takes on the punishment by dying and becoming the one sacrifice for all mankind, for all of time, he then makes perfect forever those, not who achieve perfection or work for perfection on their own, but those who trust in him and are being made holy by our trust in Jesus. And see, when all of these have been forgiven, look what the author goes on to say. And when all of these have been forgiven, sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary. Through Jesus, the debt of my sin is forgiven. And because Jesus died for us, the payment for our debt is given. And where these sacrifices have been, where Jesus as the one sacrifice for all time, forgiveness is given. And when we fail God, I want you to know, when you fail God, God's love for you will never fail you, because Jesus never failed us. And so I want you to learn to rely not on your ability to be perfect, but rely on Jesus and his love for us. And so in order to do this, write this in, to rely on God's love, I must accept God's love. We've got to learn to accept his love. We must receive it because we know we need it. And this is what I want you to write in your notes. See, the first way to accept his love is to acknowledge my need for his mercy. You know what that means? I'm wrong. You know what this means? I've sinned. Here, let's practice this together. Say, I'm wrong. Let's say it together. I'm wrong. Say it again. I'm wrong. It's not so hard. But when you get in a marriage, it's hard. When actually you are wrong and you got to confess, I've sinned. We need to learn to rely on God's mercy. And that means to realize that we are wrong. And it's okay to accept. It's okay to bring your shame into the open because God in his love will never fail you. And it's okay to deal with the shame of being wrong. It's okay to confess we're sinners and that we need mercy. It's okay. And then when we do it, we receive, write this in, I receive his forgiveness. Forgiveness comes after we confess our need for mercy. And when we rely on his love never fails us. And when we receive God's forgiveness, and we realize that we'll never be able to be perfect on our own, and that all we have to do is put our trust in Jesus upon the punishment that he took for us, that his mercy held back what we deserved, then we receive his forgiveness that we don't deserve. And that's grace. He gives us what we don't deserve. And we receive his forgiveness. And you know what that brings? That brings me freedom. That I don't have to walk in guilt anymore. That brings me freedom. That shame that I was afraid of, I don't have to be afraid of anymore. And therefore, write this in. I don't fear living in shame. I don't fear being imperfect. I don't fear the mistakes, the sin that I created. I freely can confess it, receive his mercy and his forgiveness, and walk shameless. And I don't have to cover it up. I don't have to hide it. I don't have to shift the blame. But I can acknowledge that I was wrong. And I can receive forgiveness. And I can live without the fear of shame. We don't fear then what people will think of us because we know what God thinks of us. He loves us and he proved that he loved us by dying for us. And then John, back to the passage that we started off with. This is how John ends that little passage. He says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to deal with punishment. Isn't that why we try to pass off the blame? Is we fear the result of the shame that we carry from being wrong in our sin. But the one who fears, look at this, is not made perfect in love. We don't have to fear the shame of not being perfect. When you fail, when I fail, a God who loves, we can realize, has never failed us. Maybe you're here today and you've been living in the fear of your shame, the fear of your past. Today, God wants to bring freedom to you. And it starts by saying, Jesus, I'm not perfect, but I trust you are. Jesus, I can't be perfect, and I can't deal with the punishment. I want to thank you for receiving my punishment for not being perfect. I want to learn to depend upon that. And maybe you're here today and you've never started a relationship with a God who really loves you because you painted God in a picture of the way you pictured the people around you. And today you need to step into this love by accepting his love for you. If that's you, I want you to listen to this song. And after this song, we're going to pray together. And I want to give you an invitation to accept this love. And maybe you're here today and you've been following Jesus for a long time, but you've never accepted you've never really relied on that love because you're still trying to achieve perfection. It's hard for you to admit you're wrong because you're trying to hide something. Today could be a day of freedom as you confess, I'm wrong. And Jesus, we rely on your love. Let's sing this together.